panel on the global outlook. My name is Jeff Cutmore. I work for CNBC, and you'll catch me Monday to Friday for 3 hours in the morning doing the Squawk Box program. So hopefully after this panel is finished, if you haven't already found me or CNBC, you will reach out and do so. Good. So what I want to do here is start off this panel by engaging you, our audience, before I start to ask questions of our panelists. And I want you to help me direct questions at our panel. And the question I have for you is, are we heading into recession or not? And what I'd like from you, and let me just tell you, the room is quite dark, so most of our panelists won't be able to identify you if you do put your hand up. So be reassured and be confident that you won't necessarily be seen voting. But what I'd like to do is just, with a show of hands, ask the room, the brains trust here at the World Economic Forum, the people in the audience who are concerned or believe that we are heading into a recession, could you please put your hand up? Okay, just very roughly, that feels like around half of the room to me. Nodding heads, about half the room. Right, okay. Let me ask you a different question. Who believes that the global economy will have a soft landing and that ultimately policymakers in our central banks and in our governments and heads of business will help the global economy achieve a soft landing? Who thinks that that is the most likely outcome? Please raise your hands. Okay, well, this is not scientific in any sense of the word, but on a simple count of hands in the room, I would say that around half of you feel that a recession is very likely, and a small number of you are confident that a soft landing can be achieved. So I think that gives us a very good sense of the mood in the room, and that, of course, helps me shape my questions to our panel. And let me introduce our panel, because I've made them sit here and not say anything for a few moments, and I think it's important that we bring them in because they are all very important people with very interesting connections to the global economy. So let me start with Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the IMF. Good to have you with us, of course. You appear to have set the tone, almost, of this meeting by talking about the confluence of calamities that are facing the global economy right now. So hopefully we will address some of those potential calamities, and we will address how policymakers can best negotiate them. Francois Villeroy de Gallo, the Governor of the Bank of France, a very warm welcome. You're also on the ECB Council, of course. You said on Friday that our short-term priority is fighting and mastering inflation. Events have overtaken us in a sense that Christine Lagarde today has made it very clear that the ECB is now embarking on a rate hiking cycle this year, and we may even see 50 basis points at a single meeting. We will see. I love the Gallic shrug so early on in the panel. Jane Fraser is the CEO of Citi, who forecast a brutal winter for markets, not at the beginning of the year, not a month ago, back in October of 2021. So your crystal ball was working very well, I have to say. You also expressed caution about the Chinese economy coming off the boil. So that, again, was another very prescient call, and I'm now thinking about relocating my pension fund, given that she seems to be so accurate on what is likely to unfold in markets. And David Rubenstein, co-founder and co-chair of Carlyle Group. Great to have you on the panel. You told CNBC back on the 5th of May, inflation has been a problem, but it should not cause a recession. And I think we can update that view because you were on CNBC earlier today, and I think you reiterated pretty much the same point, that you feel we can escape recession. as did President Biden when he was asked the same question. So you're an esteemed company in Tokyo within the last 24 hours or so. So let me get on to some questions. The OECD has just trimmed first quarter GDP quarter on quarter to zero or negative for most of the G7 economies. So given the mood in the room here, Managing Director, are we actually already in a recession in some G7 economies? And how concerned should we be about that?
You scared the audience effectively, but I can tell you, you have not scared your panel. So my answer is going to be no, not at this point. It doesn't mean it is out of question. We have downgraded our projections for growth for this year in April for 143 countries. This is 86% of global GDP. And since then, in a short period of time, a little bit like the weather here in Davos, the horizon has darkened. Why has it darkened? Well, when we did our projections, the war was already ongoing. Now we see the consequences going far and fast. In addition to that, tightening of financial conditions, dollar appreciation, and China slowing down. James' prediction, unfortunately, has materialized. So we are looking down this 2022. It is going to be a tough year. We have commodity price shock in many countries, and the particular shock I want to bring your attention to is food price shock. Over the last week, because of that sense that maybe the economy is getting into tougher waters, oil price went down. But food price continues to go up, 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 up. Why? We can shrink the use of petrol when growth slows down, but we have to eat every day. And the anxiety around access to food at a reasonable price globally is hitting the roof. And I don't want to be too negative at the start, but the climate crisis has gone nowhere. The digital money has hit a little rough spot. We expected that, and it happened. Nonetheless, think of numbers. 3.6 is our prediction. That is a long way from 3.6 to global recession. What we may see is recession in some countries that are weak to begin with. They haven't recovered from the COVID-induced crisis. They are highly dependent on imports from Russia of energy or imports of food, and they have somewhat weaker environment already. But we have not seen that yet.
So you've laid out, I think, very clearly for us some of the ongoing challenges. David, why do you feel more confident that recession can be escaped, and is that only for the United States?
Well, when I worked in the White House under President Carter, the inflation advisor, Fred Kahn, said that he thought we were heading into a recession right before the 1980 presidential election. And President Carter called him into the Oval Office and said, look, I'm running for re-election. Don't use the R word. It scares people. So Fred Kahn said, what am I supposed to do? I'm an honest man. So he said, just don't use the R word. Subsequently, Fred Kahn said he thought we were heading into a banana. And he used the word banana because he realized reporters wouldn't put a headline that said, Fred Kahn thinks we're heading into a banana. So I'm very reluctant to use the word recession. But let me just say that we're not in a banana yet, but I think the signs are not as favorable as I would like, only because the war in Russia and Ukraine is not likely to end soon. If the war ended tomorrow, I think the economy would bounce back. But since it's not likely to end tomorrow, I suspect that will be the precipitating factor, given all the food chain and energy problems that come about because of it. So I think, I don't want to say we're in a banana, but I would say a banana may not be that far away from where we are today, unless the war ends very quickly.
It's such an important question. I think we should let every panelist have a go at this. Jane, how do you feel about the outlook from here?
Yeah, I think, David, to your point about the R word, there are 3 R words right now. It's Russia, it's recession, and it's rates. And it depends where in the world which one is more prevalent. So in the States, it's much more about rates because there's more resiliency in the economy, in the labor market, in the consumer. The consumer is sitting there on $3.4 trillion of deposits. Coming into COVID, they were sitting on $1 trillion. So there's some buffer there. To be seen if it's used wisely or not, the jury will be out on that. I think much more concerning for Europe, that is right in the middle of the storms from supply chains, from energy crisis, and obviously just the proximity to some of the atrocities that are occurring in Ukraine. When you go elsewhere in the world, I'm just back from being in Asia and in the Middle East, and it was wonderful to see those countries again in person. They're different than they were coming out of going into COVID. When they come out of COVID, they are stronger. They're coming out of the lockdowns. There's some more sense of optimism there, and I think even China is seeing this as an event that's occurring rather than a long-term trend. They'll no doubt have some packages that they'll come to stimulate the economy. Food, to the managing director's point, is, I think, the big worry here, because that could be the wild card. When people are hungry around the world, and there's going to be 1.5 billion hungry people without necessarily either the means nor the access to food, particularly in Africa, but not only, that is a problem.
We'll come back to the policy response and how we can address that, because clearly there is going to be a difference in how people experience a dramatic economic slowdown. I just wanted to be very clear, though, because you mentioned Europe in your answer. Are you pretty much convinced, then, that Europe will experience a recession?
Yes.
Let's take this to the Bank of France governor.
And I hope I'm wrong.
Can I bring this to you, Governor, because, and let me, if you don't mind, put another little spin on this. Is the EU ultimately going to drive Europe into recession by insisting that it abandons Russian oil and gas at this stage, or is there an alternative?
So to take the European view, first we all knew from day one that this war was bad economic news, less growth and more inflation. And this is the price we accepted together to pay to protect our values, to be at the side of Ukraine and democracy. It was worth probably paying this price. We now know a bit more about the effects in Europe. About activity, and this is why I would disagree with Jane, at least so far. Activity is obviously less buoyant than at the end of last year. We had a growth in the euro area of more than 5%, 7% in France, so it was really record high. But it's resilient. If you look at German IFO this morning or at Banque de France monthly surveys, and the IMF forecast for the euro area this year was 2.7%. We'll see where we are, but it's still significantly positive. By the way, services are in better shape than industry, so it's an opposite image if you compare to COVID. So the main problem, at least in the short run, is inflation, without any doubt. And inflation in the euro area is not only higher, even is slightly less high than in the US, but 7.4%, but it's also broader. And this is probably the main issue. Core inflation is 3.4%. And this is why we have to normalize monetary policy. Without any doubt, it's what President Christine Lagarde said very clearly this morning. There is an increasing consensus in our governing council about the start of the journey. Let me say one word about our aim at the end of the journey, at least in 2 years, 24. We will bring inflation back towards 2%. And this is not only in all our forecasts. Look at all forecasts, including from the IMF, but it's our commitment. And we will do it through normalization of monetary policy and not tightening. I will perhaps elaborate on that. It's a normalization. The question of growth will come back. but I would play down the idea of a short-term trade-off between inflation and growth. In the short run, our priority is clearly, as you reminded, fighting inflation, and we will do it.
So, Governor, very clear answer. Can you be equally clear with this answer? Are rate hikes in July and August now a done deal?
In August, we have no meeting, Jeff.
September?
Well,
you can have an emergency meeting at any point.
Side. But do you want me to elaborate? No.
July and September.
Perhaps a general consideration. Attention is focusing very much on the short term. When will we precisely end net asset purchases? When will we have the first rate hike? All of this is important, but frankly, if you look at President Lagarde's statement this morning, the deal is probably done because there is a growing consensus. I think that the next steps of the journey are now more important. I made a speech 2 weeks ago about a possible roadmap going towards neutral rate and yes, achieving 2% in 24. I wouldn't over-focus on what will precisely happen in July, September, etc. But we have a roadmap.
Oh, I think central banks used to not tell people what they were going to do, and they didn't talk about it after they did it. You had to figure it out by figuring out what was going on in the market. Now, since Ben Bernanke in the United States and then Janet Yellen and Jay Powell, the Fed chairs have said it's better to tell people what we're going to do and explain what we did. And there's a plus to that, but the downside is once you say what you're going to do, if you don't do it, you've got bigger problems. So having said we're going to have 2 consecutive 50 basis point increases in the next FOMC meetings, if we don't do that, people are going to think that A, we have no concern about inflation any longer, and that's probably not realistic, or if they give a bigger increase than the 50 basis points, people are going to say, oh, it's a bigger problem than they thought before. So either way, it's a difficult thing to do anything other than what you said. And so I think what the Fed chairman said is 50 basis points the next 2 meetings. I think it'd be unlikely he would change that position.
2021, we were told that this was transitory inflation. 2022, the beginning of, we were told this is transitory inflation. Effectively, the causes of that inflation were misdiagnosed, and now we're told that the right medicine is to dramatically hike interest rates to choke off demand. We were told this is a supply-side problem. How do we know that the right medicine is actually to give the European economy 2 interest rate hikes so far, July and September, and perhaps the 2 that we're talking about in the United States?
Well,
may I?
Go ahead.
Sorry, 2 quick reactions. First, you speak, Jeff, of dramatic rate hikes, etc. This is not the kind of words which are in Christine Lagarde's statement or in my expressions. I use the word normalization for a very simple reason. We are still releasing the accelerator. We had exceptionally accommodative monetary policy with asset purchases, negative interest rates, even in our cases. And as far as we are not at neutral rate, it remains accommodative. So we are releasing the accelerator. We will see if later, after the neutral rate, we have to press the brake. And second, you are again with this idea there 50 basis points hike, etc. Frankly, we are not there. What is important is to see this journey, and it's not a dramatic change in the language. It's a change in the situation. There was a supply side shock last year, you are right. But it's why I mentioned that core inflation is increasing. And if you allow me a technical remark, in our forward guidance in the ECB, we have an important condition on underlying inflation, the third one. I think it's more and more important because if it is about core inflation, then monetary policy is relevant again.
With global debt higher than it was in 2008, inevitably markets are going to take this kind of messaging badly. David?
On inflation, I just wanted to add, it's probably a mistake for all of us to comment on these things and think about these things, to have thought that you could stimulate the U.S. economy as much as we did because of COVID, and stimulate the European economy as much as they did because of COVID, and to think that there wouldn't be inflation coming about as a result. Plus, the very loose policies the Federal Reserve and other European central banks had in terms of buying securities and so forth. So that was probably oversight to think that that wasn't going to produce inflation. And then when the war came in Ukraine, that compounded the whole thing. What we've learned before is that when inflation gets into the system, it takes a while to get in, but it takes a lot longer to get it out. And that's what Paul Volcker always used to say. It takes a lot longer to get inflation out of the system than get into the system. It's taken a couple years to get it in. It's going to take a while to get it out.
Jane.
And I think the reality is that when you're asking any of us, what's the rest of the year going to be like, we don't know. There's uncertainties, I think, that will get clearer around supply chains. So if all goes well, we're starting to see the supply of commodities beginning to outstrip demand, because to the managing director's point, you have an ability to reduce down demand somewhat on the commodity front, excluding food. So I think we're getting quite optimistic that there is a path forward from the chaos we've been seeing, that the supply and demand imbalances on commodities will ease up. That will help. But on all of the geopolitical and the other fronts, we just don't know. And so what we're asking of our central bankers is a very difficult thing, which is to take actions now without quite knowing where they'll overshoot or undershoot. And I think we've got to have some patience here and really have our eyes open and understanding what happens to consumer behavior, what happens to confidence, what happens in the corporate sector, and take this step by step.
Well, Kristalina, I mean, Managing Director, one of the problems with this story is that we know that in part the supply chain challenges have now become incredibly politicized. You know, the focus very much for companies all around the world is looking at the manufacturing hub of China and China's response to COVID. And we've talked a lot about that, you and I, in recent months, and you've given very frank views about how you think that living alongside COVID has to be the right response. But here today, we now have President Biden ratcheting up the tension again with China over the issue of Taiwan. This will only increasingly politicize the supply chain story and encourage disinvestment of Chinese businesses in America and American businesses from China. How does this help with inflation?
Let's go back. In 2021, we were all overly optimistic that having vaccines is going to eliminate lockdowns. And at that point, we didn't think that supply chain interruptions are going to play a major role. Now we know better. Supply chain interruptions because of COVID today are a major factor for the Chinese economy, for the Asian economies, for the world. The second thing we learned with the war is that there could be unthinkable shock that adds fuel to the inflation. And that is a broader lesson. We do live in a more shock-prone world. What is the conclusion if you are a business person? Forget about politicizing, not politicizing. You would say, I have to change my view of economic efficiency to include supply chain predictability. Security of supplies clearly cannot anymore be left on the theme of least cost solution. And therefore, we all have to think of the years to come, whether this change in our concept of economic efficiency that includes supply security may be a more permanent factor pushing prices up. And if it is, then since you say I'm very frank, I will be very frank. Then we all have to think collectively whether we can afford the luxury of fragmenting our economies even further. What is going on in this more shock-prone world should press us to seek ways in which we work more together. But we draw a lesson, and I'm sure Jane would know this lesson from experience, that if we want our people to support us working together, we have to be less obsessed with globalizing profit and more with localizing benefits for communities and countries. So, to put a positive note here, we did get a tax deal, 137 countries agreeing that there has to be a fair distribution of profits of global companies, some for the country they are generated, some for the countries they come from. And there should be a minimal tax that everybody subscribes to. In other words, more fairness in the way we split benefits. And then think of how, as a world, we ought to be striving for our children, for our grandchildren, to enjoy benefits of higher standard of living. If we fragment the world, we are all going to be poorer. And one point I was raising my hand. Jane talked about the fact that different countries are in very different places. And that makes me go back to recession. Today, there are two countries in deep recession. Ukraine, at least 35, maybe 40% contraction. And Russia, vis-a-vis our October projection, 11.5% contraction. And there are countries that are so severely hit by spillover of events like Sri Lanka or Lebanon or Egypt, where the pain is felt. They are in a more difficult place. But you go to the United States, in the United States, no bananas.
Well,
David, you want to pick up?
Well, 2 points I'd like to add. One, all recessions are not equal. The definition of a recession varies, and some people would say it's just 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. If you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, it can be a mild recession. And recessions aren't the end of the earth. They typically happen every 7 years or so. So it shouldn't be a great cause for alarm if it's a mild recession. Second point is that why, when all the stimulus was going into the economy, did people not worry about inflation? To some extent, the central bank's mission has changed. When the central banks were set up, their main mission was stable currency, little inflation. In recent years, decades, the mission has been changed a bit. It's worry about unemployment. And the concern about unemployment has gone to make central banks more worried about things like rising interest rates, because that will produce higher unemployment. And that's a bigger concern. That was not a concern 30 or 40 years ago, when they were really only worried about currency and currency stability. So that's a big factor. So when interest rates started, when we had the COVID problem, we could have increased interest rates and increased unemployment, but the Federal Reserve recognized that its mission was to kind of keep unemployment low, too.
Well, let me come back at you then. What do you make of the capital market reaction that we've had to the actions that the central bank has taken so far? It seems to me that there is, as we near this correction territory for the S&P, there is an argument here that the markets have overreacted. But what's your impression?
Remember when Ben Bernanke once said, maybe at some point we'll slow down quantitative easing, there was a so-called taper tantrum. And all of a sudden the market acted like they can't believe he was saying that. This time, the Federal Reserve has been saying very carefully, here's what we're going to do. We're going to tell you in advance, no surprises, no tantrums, please. And the markets overreacted. Why? Because markets are nervous, and markets like to overreact. It's like the markets have overreacted to what the Fed is doing. I can't control the markets, but I think they have overreacted a bit.
Well, they have also been complacent.
Hang on a second. I'll bring you in just a second. I know everybody wants to get in on this. But David, let me just press you for a moment, because markets have overreacted, and we think about the markets as the S&P and the Dow. If you look at the technology stocks, some of them are down over 70, 80%. It looks like 2000's tech crash all over again for some companies in that space. Is this not 2.0?
In the crash that occurred in 1999, 2000, 2001, you had internet companies with no revenues obviously no earnings. They had nothing but a business plan in some cases, and those companies shouldn't have gone public, let alone maybe been getting any capital. Now you've got a company like Netflix, which has 250 million subscribers. It may not have been worth what it was worth in the market a few months ago, but it's certainly worth probably more, in my view, than it's currently traded for. Markets overreact, and when they overreact, that's a chance for good investors to go in and say, there's an overreaction, and buy at the bottom.
Well, there's, for every Netflix, there's a Peloton or another business. I mean, I'll push it back at you, because there are a lot of people who look at the way that Wall Street has behaved over recent years, the whole SPAC phenomena, the way that the private equity community have thrown money at moonshot ideas. Has this been an irresponsible phase, and is this part of the reason why we're now going to have to take our pain?
Well, I'm not defending Wall Street and everything that was done in the SPAC market and all the valuations put on all the companies, but some of the companies that were highly valued and people made fun of for a while, like Amazon. Take Amazon. People made fun of it in 1999 and 2000, said it really shouldn't exist, and obviously turned out to be a great company. A lot of these companies whose values have gone down recently are still great companies, and maybe the value is overreacted by the market. I think there's some great buys there. I don't think it's all of a case where we 1999 and 2000. Now, SPACs is a different situation. That may be a phenomenon that may not come back again.
Anyway, sitting on a bank that sees a lot of these flows and activity globally, I think one of our observations in the US is it's actually been remarkably orderly amongst the investors. They have not sprinted to the door the way they have it with the world financial crisis when that crash happened, and where we were in 2020. We have seen a fairly systematic takedown and change in asset allocation. The fixed income markets, when we look at issuance, have been incredibly constructive. We haven't seen problems of companies or governments, indeed, being able to access the markets. And debt issuance has been identical to 2019 as it has been this year. So I think it's important not to confuse order and orderly shifts to the changes that David's talking about with some necessary corrections that occur. And from our perspective, frankly, what Chairman Powell is wanting to have happen, which is an adjustment in the behavior, and in the States, it's not only that the inflation, but it's adjustment in risk assets. We're seeing that occurring in the equity market, the credit market. There isn't so much strain yet. We've seen some in commodities, we've seen a bit in high yield, but this hasn't been the catastrophe it could have been.
Governor.
First, I want to reassure David about central bank's mission. In our case, ECB, at least, it remains very simple. We have a single primary mandate, price stability, full stop. So
in the United States, it's changed.
I said it at least
Yeah.
From the ECB standpoint. But can I come back to what Kristalina said about the supply side? Because I think it's extremely important. To put it in a nutshell, there are two significant changes this year. First, inflation is back, and this is why we will normalize monetary policy and we will deliver. And second, we are not allowed to forget about growth, but the policies are not the same. If you look at the last 10 years, it was mainly on the demand side, especially during COVID, thanks to accommodative monetary policy, and yes, fiscal policy. These two support policies will have less space for obvious reasons. And now, growth is linked with supply-side policies, be it trade, and yes, rules, and avoid fragmentation is possible, education, investment, climate change, etc. And we shouldn't forget this part of the agenda. Inflation is priority number one short term, supply side is a priority for the middle term. Can I introduce a last reflection on that, Jeff? Growth remains a positive word, probably for most of us in this audience. But if we look at to our fellow citizens, unfortunately, it's not the case. If I would oversimplify, for our older fellow citizens, growth is over, and for our younger citizens, growth is dangerous, because it's a threat to climate, etc. So we must win this battle, and this was our discussion in the G7 last week with Kristalina and others. we must show that growth is still possible, thanks to modern supply-side policies, and that it is a condition to have fairness and climate transition.
Well,
but this is a battle which is absolutely key.
we haven't mentioned globalization, and globalization